Hello everyone, and thank you for attending this presentation. I will present you today a study conducted with Blanpied, Ludovic, Hoyet, Anatole, Lécuyer, and Ferran Argelaguet that aimed at exploring the influence of threat occurrence and repeatability on the sense of embodiment and threat response in VR. Virtual reality allows users to be fully immersed in a virtual environment and also to be embodied in a virtual body commonly called avatar. Having efficient VR experiences using avatars is highly important for areas like training, medicine, as well as entertainment and social media. In such context, we want to have the illusion that our avatar is our real body. And to achieve such illusion, it is therefore important to understand how users perceive their avatar and what influences this perception. The experience of the virtual body is commonly characterized by the sense of embodiment, which was defined and divided into three subcomponents by Kilteny and al. The sense of ownership, that would be the sense of self-attribution of a body. The sense of agency, that would be the sense of having a global motor control over a body. And the sense of self-location, that would be the feeling of being spatially inside a body. The sense of embodiment refers to an individual instance of subjective experience, which is why it is often assessed by the use of subjective questionnaires. However, while such questionnaires have the advantage of being easy to use and easy to grasp and interpret, they have the disadvantage of being post-immersion and sometimes difficult to understand by participants, which is why the use of objective measures of the sense of embodiment is being increasingly frequent in embodiment studies. For instance, behavioral measures were used showing that high sense of embodiment was correlated with high behavioral changes. Yet, to this day, the most common objective measures of the sense of embodiment used remains response to a virtual threat. Its use actually go back to the original study exploring the sense of embodiment in the physical world, the rubber hand illusion, and it was shown in such context that response to threat was correlated with an assimilation of rubber hand as one's own. It was then introduced to VR, where different kinds of threats were explored and used, showing correlation between threat response and the sense of embodiment. Different ways to measure the threat response were also explored, such as galvanic skin conductance, change in user motions, and brain imagery. Yet, despite the frequent use of threat response as an objective measure of the sense of embodiment, no research was conducted to our knowledge in order to evaluate the actual effect of introducing a threat on the sense of embodiment. However, threats and correlated emotions have been shown to have an impact on several users' perceptual aspects. For instance, stress induced by threats was shown to be detrimental to cognitive functions such as spatial working or memory. In addition, fear induction was shown to be detrimental to the sense of agency of users toward the action. While these studies do not depict the context of VR, we may wonder if a virtual threat would impact similarly user cognitive functions and possibly their sense of embodiment. In addition, in most studies, a threat is only introduced at the end of the experiment, and the impact of threat repeatability on its efficiency has never been explored, leaving this question open. What is the influence of threat occurrence and repeatability on the sense of embodiment and threat response in VR? To explore this question, we conducted a VR experiment that involved 60 participants, 30 males and 30 females. Participants were immersed in a virtual factory and embodied in a virtual avatar with an HTC Vive Pro. They had Vive controllers in each hand and Vive trackers on each foot, which allowed to animate the avatar with inverse kinematics. Participants were asked to perform a task that consisted in placing an ingot on a plate and pressing a button to have it smashed by a crusher. A threat was introduced several times during the experiment, as seen in the video. It was a malfunction of the crusher. And more precisely, here was the protocol. So participants would perform the task 12 times in the first block, and then in the second block they would perform it 11 times, and the last time with a threat introduced. Finally, in the third block, they would perform the task with an alternance of safe and threat trials. In addition, participants would fill in an embodiment questionnaire at the end of each block. And we also had half of the participants that were part of a control group and who did the same experiment with no threat ever introduced. Regarding the experimental design, we had a mixed design with two independent variables, group and block. So group was a between-subject factor with two levels, threat and control, corresponding to the group which experienced threat or not. And block, a within-subject factor with three levels, first, second, and third, corresponding to the blocks of the experiments that are presented in the previous slides. In addition, regarding the collected data, we had some subjective data with the scores of the sense of embodiment from the questionnaires, but we also had some objective data in order to assess participants' physical response to threat as well as the possible changes in their behavior while performing the task after the threat. So we assessed motion of participants' dominant hand for this reason. And we had several hypotheses. First, that the sense of embodiment scores would be lower after the first threat introduction and even lower after all threat repetitions. So why this second hypothesis regarding the repetition? We thought that since virtual threats do not impact physically the real body, which makes sense, and therefore do not provide nociceptive feedback, it could lead possibly to a loss of illusion, a loss of coherence of the threat, and we thought that maybe this would have an impact on the sense of embodiment since some illusion of this virtual world would be lost in the process. And we hypothesized that in the control group there would be no change, of course, of the sense of embodiment. And finally, we hypothesized that threat response would decrease along threat repetition. So for the same reason of this absence of nociceptive feedback of virtual threats. And let's have now a look at the results. Regarding the sense of embodiment score, so the main point is that there were no significant differences in the sense of embodiment scores depending on group and order, which therefore do not validate our two first hypotheses. So it's interesting because we did expect to observe some differences regarding the impact of threats, and none were observed. So if we try to explain a bit these results, we can try to compare with one study that had influenced and motivated this one, so the study of Christensen and al. And we can try to see some differences that might have impacted the results. So, for instance, the study of Christensen and al. Were not conducted in VR, which is our case, and might have therefore an influence on the results. And in our case, the occurrences of threats were non-predictable compared to their study in which participants were aware when there would be threat or not. So how it could have had an impact? In our case, it might be that participants would have been in a constant state of expectation of threats compared to their study, even when there would be, and even when there were no threats. Which might have possibly biased our results. In addition, possible reason that we had no significant differences is that our threat was pretty fast, meaning that it was difficult for participants to see the actual collision of the virtual threat with their body, so with the crusher with the hand of the participant in this case, which for us was something that could have impacted the sense of embodiment. So because of that, it could be that we had no significant differences. And finally, third hypothesis was regarding the control group and the fact that the sense of embodiment would remain the same. We actually only partially validate this hypothesis, since we can actually see for ownership scores that there is a tendency to decrease. So it's not significant for the global ownership scores, but for two questions of ownership in the questionnaire, if we take them independently, there were some significant differences for both groups regarding the block. So what might have led to this result? It's not easy to say, but it might be just the time, the exposure time, which could lead to a decrease of ownership. but also the fact of answering all those questionnaires. So because each time you answer questionnaires, you think about the virtual body, this representation, and maybe it has therefore impacted the perception, but we cannot really conclude on that. And now let's have a look on the objective data. So with the motions of participants' dominant hand, we computed some speed profiles of the dominant hand in some trials. So here we are looking at threat trials, so trials in which threat occurs. So we actually observe the reaction of the hand when the threat happened. And what we can see is that there is a big difference between the first threat reaction and all the other threat reactions. So it makes sense somehow because the first time it happened, it takes a bit more time to react because the threat was not expected, while in the second time, since the second time, participants expect more, so are faster to react, which explains this decreased reaction time. Yet, we really had this hypothesis, H4, that after all the repetitions, the threat response would decrease, which is not significatively the case, even though we actually see a tendency of change in threat response after the repetitions, but possibly more trials, more repetition would be needed to see an actual effect. So it does not validate H4. We were also interested in speed profiles of dominant hand in the safe trials to see the impact on participants' behavior. So we can see here safe trials for the control group, and now on the right for the threat group. And what we can see is that we have a change in speed profile, a faster approaching motion in the last trial, showing potential impact of the threat on the behavior, even in trials where there is no actual threat. So to conclude, it was the first study exploring the actual impact of threat on the sense of embodiment. We found that embodiment studies should expect potential changes in participant behavior while doing a task after a threat, but that threat introduction and repetition do not seem to impact the subjective measure of the sense of embodiment, which is a good thing for embodiment studies involving threats, although we must consider that this is for this context, task, and type of threat. Which actually lead us to some future work ideas. So regarding the type of threats, we believe it would be interesting to explore different types of threats. As I had said before, maybe threat with more obvious collision with the virtual body would be interesting and could lead maybe to some impact on the sense of embodiment. Regarding the repeatability, it would be interesting to investigate the impact of more threat repeatability and increased exposure. Regarding the context, it would be interesting to explore different virtual contexts and environments. So our virtual environment was really realistic, as well as the task. So it would be interesting to explore different contexts and as well tasks maybe involving different parts of the body. And regarding the measure of threat response, it would be interesting to replicate similar study with different objective measures of threat response, like skin conductance, for instance. So thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to answer your questions.